Cole knelt in the red dirt of 7 and collected another soil sample. The frontier planet had been open for joint colonization for 2 years now, but humans and the native species rarely crossed paths. The tall, wolf-like aliens with silver fur and amber eyes preferred to keep their distance. They had their villages in the eastern forests, and the humans had their outpost called Horizon Base in the western plains. That arrangement suited everyone just fine. Was an agricultural specialist. His job was to figure out how to grow earth crops in alien soil. It was quiet work, and he liked it that way. He had come to 7 to escape the noise of Earth, to escape the memories that followed him everywhere. His younger sister had died in an accident 8 years ago, and he still blamed himself for not being there to protect her. Working alone in the valleys of an alien world helped him forget, at least for a few hours at a time. He sealed the sample container and stood up to stretch his back. The sun was beginning to drop toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. He needed to start heading back to base soon. The valley he was surveying was 3 hours from the outpost by foot, and he did not want to be caught in the wilderness after dark. That was when he heard the sound. It was soft, almost like the wind, but it had a rhythm to it. A whimpering, turned his head and listened. The sound came from a cluster of rocks about 50 meters away. He walked toward it slowly, his boots crunching on the dry ground. Behind the largest rock, huddled in a tight ball, was a child. A child. She could not have been older than 6 or 7 in human terms. Her silver fur was matted with dirt, and her amber eyes were wide with fear. There was a cut on her leg, not deep but clearly painful. She flinched when she saw and pressed herself harder against the rock. Stopped moving. He held up his hands to show he meant no harm. The child stared at him with those huge amber eyes, trembling. He knew only a handful of words in the language, barely enough to say hello and goodbye. He tried anyway. "Safe," he said pointing to himself. "Friend." The child did not respond. She just kept staring at him like he was a monster from a nightmare. Slowly lowered himself to the ground, making himself smaller and less threatening. He reached into his pack and pulled out his water canteen. He took a sip from it first to show it was safe, then held it out toward her. She did not move for a long time. Minutes passed. Waited patiently, the canteen extended in his hand. Finally, the child's thirst overcame her fear. She crept forward and snatched the canteen from him, drinking deeply. Water spilled down her chin and onto her dusty clothing. Smiled gently. He reached into his pack again and found a nutrient bar. He unwrapped it and broke it in half, eating one piece himself before offering the other to her. She took it and ate it in 3 bites. He examined her leg wound from a distance. It was not serious, but it needed to be cleaned and bandaged. He pointed to her leg and then to his medical kit, trying to communicate his intention. The child watched him warily as he slowly pulled out antiseptic and bandages. He held them up so she could see them, then pointed to her leg again. She hesitated, then extended her injured leg toward him, cleaned the wound as gently as he could. She winced but did not cry out. He wrapped the bandage around her leg and secured it with medical tape. When he was finished, she looked at the white bandage with curiosity, touching it with her small clawed fingers. Now came the hard part. Knew the nearest village was at least a full day's walk from here, through difficult terrain. The had made it very clear that humans were not welcome near their settlements. There had been incidents in the past, misunderstandings that had nearly turned violent. Entering their territory could be seen as an act of aggression. He could be attacked on sight. But he could not leave this child here alone. She would not survive the night. The predators that roamed these lands after dark would find her, and she was too small and too weak to defend herself. Looked at the child, and the child looked back at him. In that moment, she was not an alien. She was just a lost little girl who was scared and hurt and far from home. He thought of his sister, of all the times he had failed to protect her. He was not going to fail again. He stood up and held out his hand. The child stared at it, not understanding the gesture, crouched back down and gently took her hand in his, showing her what he meant. Her small fingers were covered in soft fur and her claws were sharp but tiny. He helped her to her feet. "Come," he said, pointing toward the distant tree line that marked the edge of territory. "Home." She seemed to understand, or maybe she just understood that he was trying to help. Either way, she let him lead her forward. They walked together as the sun continued to sink, casting long shadows across the valley floor. After an hour, the child began to stumble. Her injured leg was bothering her and she was exhausted. Stopped and knelt down with his back to her. He gestured for her to climb on. She hesitated, then wrapped her small arms around his neck. He stood up, supporting her weight with his arms, and continued walking. She was lighter than he expected. Her breath was warm against his ear, and her fur smelled like pine needles and something sweet he could not identify. As they walked, he felt her body slowly relax. The trembling stopped. Her grip on his neck loosened as exhaustion her. By the time darkness fell, had found a small cave to shelter in for the night. He set the sleeping child down on a bed of soft leaves he had gathered and covered her with his jacket. She stirred but did not wake. He sat at the entrance of the cave, keeping watch, listening to the strange sounds of the alien night. As he watched over her, he noticed something that made him pause. The clothing she wore was not ordinary. It was decorated with intricate symbols and patterns, woven in threads of gold and deep blue. These were not the clothes of a common child. They were the clothes of someone important. Wondered who she was. He wondered if her family was searching for her, if they were worried sick. He pushed the questions aside. It did not matter who she was. She was a child who needed help and he was going to get her home. That was all that mattered. He leaned back against the cave wall and watched the stars appear one by one in the alien sky. Tomorrow would be a long day. But for now, the child was safe, and that was enough. Woke at dawn to find the child sitting beside him, watching his face with those large amber eyes. She had pulled his jacket around her small body, and her silver fur caught the first light of morning. When she saw that he was awake, she made a soft chirping sound that might have been a greeting. He smiled at her and sat up slowly, his back stiff from sleeping against the cave wall. He checked her leg wound and found that it was healing well. The bandage was still clean and secure. He offered her water and another nutrient bar for breakfast, and she accepted both without hesitation. The fear in her eyes had faded overnight. She still watched him carefully, but there was curiosity there now instead of terror. Pointed toward the east, where the sun was rising over the distant mountains. "Home," he said again. "We go." She nodded, a gesture she seemed to have learned from watching him. He gathered his pack, and they set out together into the morning light. The terrain grew more difficult as they traveled. The flat valleys gave way to steep ridges covered in loose stone. Had to climb slowly, testing each foothold before putting his weight on it. The child followed behind him, nimble despite her injured leg. When they reached particularly difficult sections, he would lift her up and carry her until the ground leveled out again. By midday, they had entered a dense forest. The trees here were massive, with trunks as wide as houses and branches that blocked out most of the sunlight. Strange birds called to each other in the canopy above. The child stayed close to, her hand gripping the back of his shirt. They stopped by a stream to rest and refill the water canteen. The child knelt by the water and watched the small fish-like creatures swimming in the current. She pointed at them and made a series of sounds that could not understand. He nodded and smiled anyway, and she seemed pleased by his response. He had started calling her little one in his mind. He knew she had a real name, but he did not know how to ask for it. The language barrier between them was vast, but they had developed their own simple way of communicating. Gestures, expressions, and tone of voice carried meaning even when words could not. The trouble came in the afternoon. They were crossing a narrow ridge when heard a low, growling sound from the rocks ahead. He stopped immediately and pushed little one behind him. 3 creatures emerged from the shadows and felt his stomach tighten with fear. They were predators, about the size of large dogs but built like armored cats. Their bodies were covered in overlapping plates of bone-like material, and their mouths were filled with rows of sharp teeth. They spread out in a half circle, blocking the path forward. Their eyes were fixed on Little One. Did not have a weapon. He had never needed one before. He was just a farmer who studied dirt. But right now, he was the only thing standing between these predators and a child. He made himself as large as possible, spreading his arms wide and puffing out his chest. He shouted at the top of his lungs, a wordless roar of defiance. The creatures hesitated, surprised by the sudden noise, grabbed a rock from the ground and threw it at the nearest predator, striking it on the snout. The creature snarled but backed away. He kept shouting, kept throwing rocks, kept making himself seem like more trouble than he was worth. Little One pressed against his back, her small body trembling. The standoff lasted for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Finally, the lead predator made a decision. It turned and retreated into the rocks, and the others followed. Did not relax until the creatures were completely out of sight. His hands were shaking, and his heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. He turned to check on Little One. She was staring up at him with an expression he could not read. Then she reached out and took his hand, squeezing it tightly. They continued walking, moving faster now. Wanted to put as much distance as possible between them and those predators before nightfall. The next obstacle came sooner than he expected. A river blocked their path, swollen from recent rains. The water was moving fast, churning with white foam. Studied the river, looking for a safe place to cross. He found a section where large rocks broke the surface, creating a series of stepping stones. He went first, testing each rock before committing his weight to it. The stones were slippery with moss, and the current pulled at his legs with surprising strength. When he reached the middle of the river, he turned and held out his hand for Little One. She stepped onto the first rock, then the second. On the third, her foot slipped, lunged for her, but he was too slow. She fell into the water and was immediately swept downstream. Did not think. He did not calculate the risks or consider the consequences. He simply dove in after her. The cold water hit him like a wall. The current grabbed him and pulled him under. He fought his way back to the surface, gasping for air, his eyes searching desperately for Little One. He saw her silver fur flash in the churning water ahead. She was struggling to keep her head above the surface, her small arms flailing. He swam with everything he had, letting the current carry him toward her while he fought to close the distance. His hand caught her arm and he pulled her against his chest. She clung to him, coughing and crying. He kicked toward the shore, fighting the current with every ounce of strength he had left. His feet found the riverbed, and he dragged them both onto the bank. They collapsed on the muddy ground, soaked and exhausted. Little One was shivering violently, her wet fur plastered against her body. Stripped off his wet jacket and wrapped it around her anyway, then pulled her close and held her until the shivering stopped. They made camp early that night, built a small fire using the emergency kit in his pack, and they huddled close to the flames. Their clothes steamed as they dried. Little One sat in his lap, her head resting against his chest. As the stars came out, she began to sing. It was a soft, lilting melody in the language, probably a lullaby her mother had taught her. Listened, memorizing the sounds even though he did not understand the words. When she finished, she looked up at him expectantly. He tried to sing it back to her. His pronunciation was terrible and he got half the notes wrong, but Little One laughed, a bright and beautiful sound that filled the quiet night. It was the first time he had heard her laugh freely, without fear or reservation. He found himself laughing too. The next morning, as they resumed their journey, noticed figures watching them from the trees. Scouts, their silver fur blending with the shadows. They did not approach, only observed. Raised his hands to show he meant no harm. The scouts vanished into the forest as silently as they had appeared. He knew word of his presence was spreading. He was deep in territory now, carrying one of their children. He had no idea how they would react when he finally reached the village, but he had come too far to turn back now. By the third morning, they reached the edge of a clearing. On the other side stood a group of warriors, tall and imposing, their amber eyes hard and suspicious. They carried spears and wore armor made of leather and bone. Their leader stepped forward and spoke a single word. Did not understand the word, but he understood the tone. It was recognition. It was shock. Whatever that word meant, it changed everything. The warriors surrounded but did not attack. They took little one from him gently, almost reverently. Then they gestured for him to follow. He walked into the unknown, surrounded by aliens who could kill him with a single strike. But little one looked back at him and smiled, and somehow that made everything feel like it would be okay. The warriors led through the forest in complete silence. No one spoke to him. No one explained what was happening. He walked in the center of the group, surrounded by tall figures with silver fur and eyes that watched his every movement. Little one was carried ahead by one of the warriors, and she kept turning her head to look back at as if to make sure he was still there. After an hour of walking, they emerged from the dense forest into the most remarkable place had ever seen. The village was built into the trees themselves. Massive structures rose from the forest floor and climbed up the trunks of ancient giants, connected by rope bridges and wooden platforms. Thousands have lived here, going about their daily lives in this vertical city of wood and vine. Everything stopped when entered the village. Of all ages paused in their activities and turned to stare. Children peeked out from behind their parents. Elders watched from high platforms with expressions could not read. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of boots on the wooden walkways. He felt very small and very alone. He was the only human for miles, surrounded by a species that had made it clear they wanted nothing to do with his kind. Every instinct told him to run, but there was nowhere to go. And besides, he had come here to return little one to her family. He would see this through to the end. The warriors led him to the largest structure in the village, a great hall carved from a single enormous tree. The entrance was flanked by guards who stepped aside as the procession approached, was guided inside, and the doors closed behind him with a heavy thud. The interior of the hall was vast and dimly lit by glowing crystals embedded in the walls. Hundreds have stood along the edges of the room, their eyes fixed on. At the far end of the hall, seated on a throne of twisted roots, was the oldest he had ever seen. Her fur was almost entirely white, with only traces of silver remaining. Her amber eyes were clouded with age but still sharp with intelligence. She wore robes of deep purple decorated with golden symbols. This was the chieftain, knew it without being told. Beside the chieftain stood little one, but she looked different now. Someone had cleaned her fur and dressed her in ceremonial robes that matched the chieftain's. The elaborate symbols had noticed on her clothing before made sense now. They were marks of royalty. A step forward from the crowd. He was younger than the others and wore a device around his neck that glowed with soft blue light. When he spoke, the device translated his words into accented but understandable English. "Human," he said, "you stand in the presence of Chieftain, leader of all tribes on 7. The child you carried through the wilderness is called. She is the chieftain's granddaughter and the heir to her position." His mouth went dry. He had known the child was important, but he had never imagined this. He had been carrying the future leader of an entire civilization on his back. The translator continued. Every generation, the heir apparent must complete the trial of return. The child is sent into the wilderness alone. If she finds her way back without assistance, she proves her strength and independence. If a stranger returns her, that stranger's actions are judged. The character of the one who helps determines whether the heir is worthy to lead. Felt the weight of hundreds of eyes pressing down on him. He thought back over the past 3 days. The predators, the river, the cold nights and long walks. Every moment had been watched. Every decision had been evaluated. "Our scouts observed you from the moment you found," the translator said. "They saw you offer her water and food when she was afraid. They saw you bandage her wound with gentle hands. They saw you carry her when she grew tired, even though the burden slowed your journey." The translator paused, and the chieftain spoke. Her voice was thin with age but carried a power that filled the hall. The translator rendered her words. "They saw you place yourself between and the beasts that would have killed her. They saw you dive into the raging river without hesitation to save her life. They saw you hold her through the night to keep her warm." Remembered all of it. He had not done any of those things for praise or reward. He had done them because they were the right things to do. The chieftain rose slowly from her throne. Despite her age, she still stood tall and proud. She descended the steps and walked toward, her white fur glowing in the crystal light. The crowd parted before her in respectful silence. She stopped directly in front of and looked up into his face. He was taller than her, but in that moment he felt like the smaller one. Her amber eyes searched his, looking for something he could not name. Then she spoke again, and the translator rendered her question. "Why did you help her? You owe us nothing. Your people and mine have no alliance. We have shown you only coldness and suspicion. Why did you risk your life for a child who is not your own?" The hall fell completely silent. Every leaned forward, waiting for his answer. Knew that whatever he said next would determine his fate. It might determine the fate of relations between humans and for generations to come. He took a deep breath and spoke from his heart. "When I was young, I had a sister," he said. "She was small and curious and full of life. One day there was an accident. I was not there to protect her and she died. I have carried that guilt with me ever since." He paused, gathering his thoughts. The translator waited patiently. "When I found in that valley, I did not see a child. I did not see an alien. I saw a little girl who was lost and scared and hurt. I saw someone who needed help. And where I come from, you do not leave children behind. You do not calculate whether they are part of your tribe or another. You do not weigh the risks against the rewards. You simply help because that is what it means to be a decent person." He looked at who was watching him with those familiar amber eyes. "I did not know she was your heir. I did not know there was a test. I would have done the same thing if she had been the child in your village, because her life has value. Every child's life has value, and protecting children is not something you do for reward. It is something you do because it is right." The chieftain listened to the translation without expression. When finished speaking, she was silent for a long moment. The entire hall held its breath. Then she did something that made everyone gasp. She reached out and placed her hand over his heart. The translator spoke in a hushed voice. "This gesture is called the touch of trust. It has not been given to an outsider in 300 years. The chieftain spoke again, and this time her voice was warm. "You are what we call a shield heart, one who protects without expectation of reward. You have proven that your people are capable of great honor and compassion." She turned to address the hall. "Has passed her trial. A leader is defined by the allies she attracts, and my granddaughter attracted a shield heart. She will be recognized as my heir." A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. Smiled at, and he found himself smiling back. But the chieftain was not finished. She turned back to with a look of determination in her ancient eyes. "You will stay for the recognition ceremony as our honored guest, and when it is complete, we will speak of other matters. I believe it is time for our peoples to know each other better." Bowed his head in acceptance. He had come here to return a lost child. He had never imagined it would lead to this. But as ran forward and took his hand, he realized that some of the most important moments in life come when you least expect them. 3 days had passed since arrived in the village, and in that time his world had changed completely. The aliens who had once seemed cold and hostile now greeted him with nods of respect when he walked through the village. Children followed him around, fascinated by his strange appearance. They touched his hairless skin with curious fingers and giggled at the sounds of human words. had been given a small dwelling high in the trees, connected to the main village by a rope bridge. The room was simple but comfortable, with a soft bed of woven fibers and windows that looked out over the endless forest. Every morning, a young brought him food and water. Every evening, villagers invited him to share their meals and attempted conversations despite the language barrier. Visited him every day. The young heir apparent seemed to have adopted him as her personal responsibility. She taught him words and laughed at his terrible pronunciation. She showed him her favorite spots in the village and introduced him to her friends. Through the translator, she told him stories about her people, their history, and their customs. Learned that they had been watching humanity since they first arrived on Seven. They had seen humans clear forests and pollute rivers. They had seen arguments and greed and carelessness. But they had also seen humans help each other, sacrifice for strangers, and treat the land with respect. The elders had been divided on whether to approach humanity or to keep their distance forever. Now, because of what had done, that debate was coming to an end. The day of the recognition ceremony arrived with clear skies and warm sunshine. The entire village had been decorated with banners of gold and purple, the colors of the ruling family. From distant tribes had traveled for days to witness the event. The great hall was filled to capacity, with hundreds more watching from platforms outside. Stood near the front of the hall, in a place of honor reserved for distinguished guests. He wore his cleanest clothes, though they still looked rough compared to the elaborate robes of the around him. The translator stood beside him, ready to explain the proceedings. The ceremony began with music. Musicians played instruments had never seen before, creating sounds that were strange but beautiful. Dancers moved through the hall in carefully choreographed patterns, their silver fur shimmering in the crystal light. The crowd watched in respectful silence. Then Chieftain entered, supported by two attendants. She moved slowly but with dignity, her white fur glowing like fresh snow. She took her place on the throne of twisted roots and raised one hand. The music stopped. The dancers, all eyes turned to the entrance, walked into the hall alone. She was dressed in ceremonial robes even more elaborate than before, with a small crown of woven silver on her head. She moved with a grace and confidence that seemed impossible for someone so young. Remembered the frightened child he had found huddled behind a rock, and he marveled at the transformation. She walked the length of the hall and knelt before her grandmother. The chieftain spoke words in the ancient tongue, words that the translator whispered too. "Do you accept the burden of leadership? Do you swear to protect our people, to guide them with wisdom, and to stand between them and all who would do them harm?" Responded in a clear, strong voice, "I accept, I swear, I will be the shield that guards my people." The chieftain placed her hands on his head in blessing. "Then rise, recognized heir to the tribes of, may your reign bring peace and prosperity to all." The hall erupted in cheers and howls of celebration, stamped their feet and raised their voices in a song of joy, rose and turned to face her people, her eyes shining with emotion. Then she did something unexpected. She raised her hand for silence and the hall gradually quieted. She spoke, and the translator rendered her words for. "Before I accept the blessings of our people, I must honor the one who made this day possible," she said. "When I was lost and alone, frightened and hurt, a stranger found me. He did not know who I was. He did not seek reward or recognition. He simply saw a child in need and chose to help." She turned and looked directly at. "He carried me on his back when I could not walk. He faced predators with nothing but rocks and his own courage. He pulled me from a raging river and held me through the cold night. He sang me songs and made me laugh when I was afraid." She stepped down from the platform and walked toward. The crowd parted before her, watching in fascination. "In our ancient traditions, there is a title that has not been bestowed in many generations," continued. "It was given to those rare outsiders who proved themselves to be true friends of the people. Today, I revive this tradition." She stopped in front of and reached up to take his hand. "Cole, I name you my first friend beyond the fur. From this day forward, you will always have a place at my side. Your counsel will be welcome and your friendship will be honored. When I become chieftain, you will be the first human to serve as an advisor to our people." Did not know what to say. His throat felt tight and his eyes stung with unexpected emotion. He had come to this planet to escape his past, to bury himself in quiet work and forget his failures. Instead, he had found something he never expected. He had found purpose. He had found acceptance. He had found a strange and wonderful family among the silver-furred people of the trees. "I am honored," he managed to say. "I will try to be worthy of your trust." Smiled up at him, and for a moment she looked like the little girl he had found in the wilderness. "You already are," she said. The ceremony continued with feasting and dancing that lasted well into the night. Sat beside and chieftain at the high table, eating food that ranged from delicious to deeply strange. He tried a fermented drink that burned his throat and made his head spin. He attempted dances and failed spectacularly, much to the amusement of everyone watching. Late in the evening, Chieftain summoned to a quiet corner of the hall. The translator accompanied them, and they sat together on cushions while the celebration continued around them. "You have changed things, Cole," the chieftain said through the translator. "For generations, my people have debated whether to trust humanity. Some argued that your kind would bring only destruction. Others believed that humans and could live in peace. Today, you have proven that the hopeful ones were right." Shook his head. "I did not do anything special. I just helped a lost child." The chieftain smiled, and despite her age, her eyes sparkled with warmth. "That is exactly what makes it special. You did not plan or calculate. You simply acted from the goodness of your heart. That kind of instinctive compassion cannot be faked or performed. It comes from who you truly are." She leaned forward. "I am old, Cole. I will not live to see the world my granddaughter will build, but I want to give her the best possible start. I want to build a bridge between our peoples while I still can." She placed her aged hand on his. "I would like you to serve as a liaison between humans and, not as a diplomat or a politician, but as a friend to both peoples. Someone who can help us understand each other." Thought about his quiet life at Horizon Base, his solitary work in the fields, his deliberate isolation from everyone and everything. He thought about the grief he had carried for so long, the guilt that had driven him to the far edges of the galaxy. Then he thought about his hand in his. He thought about the laughter of the children who followed him through the village. He thought about the chieftain's touch of trust and the title of first friend beyond the fur. Maybe it was time to stop running. Maybe it was time to build something instead. "I would be honored," he said. The chieftain nodded with satisfaction. "Then tomorrow we begin a new chapter in the history of our peoples. Tonight we celebrate, tomorrow we work." She rose slowly and returned to the celebration, leaving alone with his thoughts. He watched the dance and sing and laugh, and he felt something he had not felt in years. He felt hope. Returned to Horizon Base on a bright morning, escorted by a group of warriors who had once seemed so threatening. Now they walked beside him as companions, pointing out interesting plants and animals along the way. Had wanted to come, but her grandmother had insisted she stay for additional ceremonies. The young heir had pouted but obeyed, making promise to return soon. The human outpost came into view as they crested a hill. It was a small collection of prefabricated buildings surrounded by agricultural fields, home to about 200 colonists. Had lived there for 2 years, but it had never really felt like home. It had just been a place to exist. The warriors stopped at the edge of the settlement. They would not enter human territory uninvited, but they waited to make sure arrived safely. He turned and raised his hand in farewell, and they returned the gesture before melting back into the forest. Walked into the outpost and was immediately surrounded by chaos. People ran toward him, shouting questions and exclamations. The colony administrator, a woman named Grace, pushed through the crowd and grabbed him by the shoulders. "Where have you been?" she demanded. "You disappeared 5 days ago. We thought you were dead. We were planning a search party, but we were afraid of entering territory." Smiled tiredly. "It is a long story." He was brought to the administration building and seated in Grace's office. She handed him a cup of coffee, the first he had tasted in nearly a week, and he drank it gratefully. Then he told her everything: the lost child, the journey through the wilderness, the test he had unknowingly participated in, the recognition ceremony and the title he had been given, the chieftain's proposal for a liaison. Grace listened in silence, her expression shifting from disbelief to amazement to something like awe. When finished, she sat back in her chair and let out a long breath. "Let me make sure I understand," she said slowly. "You stumbled onto the heir to the leadership, carried her through dangerous territory, and accidentally passed some kind of ancient test. And now you are a formal friend of their ruling family, invited to serve as a bridge between our peoples." "That is about right," said. Grace laughed, a sound of pure disbelief. "Our diplomatic team has been trying to establish contact with them for 3 years. They would not even respond to our messages. And you, a soil specialist, managed to create an alliance by returning a lost child." Shrugged. "I did not try to accomplish anything. I just helped a kid get home." Grace shook her head slowly. "You know what the really strange part is? I believe that is exactly why it worked. You were not trying to get anything from them. You were not calculating angles or seeking advantages. You were just being a decent human being." She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the colony. "The politicians back on Earth are going to lose their minds when they hear about this. They have been worried about the situation for years. An unfriendly native population on a valuable frontier world is a serious problem. And now, because of one man and one lost child, everything might change." Did not care about politics. He did not care about diplomatic victories or strategic advantages. He cared about the people who had welcomed him into their village, about the promise he had made to help build understanding between two species. In the weeks that followed, preparations began for the first formal meeting between human and representatives. A location was chosen halfway between Horizon Base and the village, a neutral ground where both peoples could meet as equals. Worked with both sides to prepare, answering questions about customs for the humans and explaining human behavior to the. The day of the meeting arrived under cloudy skies. Stood at the meeting ground, watching both delegations approach from opposite directions. The humans came in their formal uniforms, nervous and uncertain. They came in their ceremonial robes, cautious but curious. Chieftain led her people. Despite her age, she had insisted on attending this historic event. Walked beside her, wearing the robes of the recognized heir. When she saw, her face lit up with a smile that bridged all the distance between their species. Grace led the human delegation. She had prepared extensively for this moment, practicing greetings and studying cultural protocols. But when she faced the chieftain for the first time, all her preparation seemed inadequate. She looked to for guidance. He stepped forward and spoke to both groups. "This is Chieftain, leader of the tribes on this world, and this is Administrator Grace, leader of the human colony. They have both come here today because they believe our peoples can live in peace. They have both shown courage by taking this first step." He turned to the chieftain. "The humans are nervous. They do not know your customs and they are afraid of giving offense, but they come with open hearts and genuine hope." Then he turned to Grace. "They have been watching us for years, waiting to see what kind of people we truly are. They value honor, courage, and compassion above all things. If we show them who we really are, they will welcome us as friends." The chieftain stepped forward and spoke, her words translated by the device around the translator's neck. "For generations, my people have lived apart from yours. We watched your ships land on our world and we did not know what to expect. We saw things that worried us. but we also saw things that gave us hope. She gestured toward. This man showed us the best of humanity. He risked his life for a child he did not know, asked for nothing in return, and proved that humans can be trusted. Because of him, we are willing to take this chance. Grace cleared her throat and spoke in return. My people came to Seven seeking new opportunities, new land, and new beginnings. We did not understand your people or your ways. We made mistakes, but we are here today because we believe we can do better. We believe we can be neighbors, partners, and perhaps even friends. The two leaders looked at each other across the clearing. Centuries of isolation hung in the air between them. Then Chieftain extended her hand in the human gesture of greeting, a gesture she had learned specifically for this moment. Grace took her hand and shook it gently. A murmur of wonder passed through both groups. Some of them nodded in approval. Some of the humans wiped tears from their eyes. It was such a small gesture, but it carried the weight of history. The meeting continued for hours. The two sides discussed trade, territory, and cooperation. They established rules for contact and agreed to exchange cultural ambassadors. It was only the beginning, only the first step on a long road, but it was a beginning. As the sun began to set, slipped away from her grandmother's side and walked over too. He was standing at the edge of the gathering, watching the negotiations with quiet satisfaction. "You did this," she said through her translator device. Shook his head. "I just returned a lost child. Everyone else did the rest." Smiled at him, that familiar smile he had first seen in the firelight of their wilderness camp. "My grandmother says that great changes often come from small actions. She says the stars themselves are just tiny points of light, but together they illuminate the universe." She reached out and took his hand just as she had during their journey together. "Thank you, Cole. Thank you for finding me. Thank you for carrying me home. Thank you for being my first friend beyond the fur." Squeezed her small hand gently. He thought about his sister, about the guilt he had carried for so long. He had come to Seven to hide from his past, but instead he had found a future. He had found purpose. He had found a family that transcended species. "Thank you for getting lost," he said with a gentle smile. "It was the best thing that ever happened to me." They stood together and watched the sun set over the frontier world, human and side by side. Behind them, the delegations continued their historic discussions, laying the foundation for a partnership that would shape the future of both peoples. Did not know what the years ahead would bring. He did not know if this fragile peace would last or if old fears would eventually tear it apart. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. It had all started because he refused to leave a lost child alone in the wilderness. It had started because he did what any decent person would do. And that, he thought as he watched the first stars appear in the darkening sky, was the most human thing he could have done.